Mexico City, North America's biggest city, home of one of the world's most overutilized airport, and also home of one of the world's most controversial new airports. Today, we're looking at Mexico City's new Felipe Ángeles International Airport, or AIFA for its initials in Spanish. We're going to talk about why and how it was built, the reception it has received, and some of the major lessons learned and takeaways from the new airport rollout. Welcome to Transit World, weekly videos on all things transportation, with a focus on the developing world. So, why does Mexico City have a new airport? Well, the short answer is pretty obvious. The old airport is insufficient to keep up with demand. The Benito Juarez Airport, or MEX for its three-letter call sign, is by pretty much any measure very overcrowded. Over the past several decades, there has been near constant demand for growth, but at least at this point, there's really no more space to grow the supply. The airport has two runways which pretty much operate at their full physical capacity most of the day, and the airport actually operates near 1.5 times its designed capacity. The airport has other issues as well. For example, it's slowly sinking at about 30 centimeters per year into the ground, which means that there have been a lot of infrastructure maintenance requirements and just general issues with upkeep for the airport. Mexico City has known really since the middle of the 20th century that they needed to increase airport capacity, and there's a long history of attempts to do so. All the way back in 1970, the Mexico City airport was expanded for the first time, and then just a few years after that, in 1974, there were already explorations of the Zumpango site, which is near the new AIFA site, which was selected officially actually as a new Mexico City airport location. In 1978, 4 years later, the Secretary of Defense also announced that AIFA, the next door neighbor, would be upgrading to a civil airport for domestic flights. But in the years to come, both of those plans essentially fell apart for various reasons. Despite that, MEX continued to grow, handling over 10 million passengers for the first time in 1979, and expanding again in 1980 to try to keep up with demand. In 1984, there was an alternative airport which was opened in Toluca, and this helped a little bit, but the airport was far, and you needed to pass through a mountain range to get there, which made it hard to attract passengers. Toluca is also an airport at high altitude, which makes aircraft operations less efficient, and that detracted airlines from flying out there en masse. So despite the addition of Toluca, all throughout the remainder of the 80s and into the early 2000s, there were multiple expansion efforts at MEX airports, and in '94 there was also a presidential decree to prohibit general aviation, move all of that to Toluca. All of this was in an attempt to free up as much space as possible and to create as much supply at the MEX airport. In 2001, then President Vicente Fox announced a construction of a new airport in the area of Texcoco. Unfortunately, though, this led to violent protests with the residents that were going to be displaced by the airport, and the project was canceled shortly thereafter. In the face of increasing demand, MEX was again expanded in 2004, and then Toluca was also expanded in 2006. This expanded Toluca was supposed to take up to 25% of all the traffic from MEX, which actually did happen for a small period in the late 2000s, but it never quite got back there since. To try to help with these capacity issues, in November 2007, a second terminal for MEX was opened. This did include more gates, but it didn't include any runway expansions, so this only led to a limited increase in capacity. And this was really the end of any possible expansion at MEX, unless you essentially built a new airport next door and connected the two with either a bus or a train service, which actually was an idea that was entertained several times, but never gained traction. So at this point in 2007, MEX was completely capped out. In 2014, then President Peña Nieto, in his State of the Union address, announced that they would be building again a new airport in Texcoco. This time it would be built almost entirely on government-owned land to avoid the issues of the previous Texcoco proposal. This also was a really ambitious mega project. It was even dubbed by the New York Times as the Heathrow Airport of Latin America, and it was planned to be the second biggest airport in the entire world once completed, with 6 runways and 125 million annual passengers. About a year later, construction broke ground on this new Texcoco airport, and this seemed to be the real deal. Finally, Mexico City would have its big, shiny airport. That was until 2018, that is, when there was a change in presidential leadership and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's known in Mexico by his initials, came into power. AMLO was very opposed to Texcoco because he thought it was too expensive, too opulent, and that the construction was too corrupt. So in October 2018, which was actually a few months before he came into power, he organized a referendum. This referendum, even though it was not an actual official referendum since he wasn't in power and it only had 1 million people that voted for it, did decide overwhelmingly through the results in a 2/3 majority to abandon the project in Texcoco, for whatever that's worth. So just a few months later, when AMLO came into power, construction was officially suspended at the Texcoco site, despite the fact that 30% had been finished already. A few months later, in July 2019, construction started at the AIFA site. And on March 21st, 2022, AIFA officially opened. Mexico City had its new airport. What a ride. So let's talk about the reception of this airport. Let's start with the big one that has by far gathered the most public attention, which is related to accessibility of the airport. AIFA is located 45 kilometers north-northwest from the center of Mexico City. And many people have complained that this is quite a long distance to go to get to the new airport, especially considering that the current airport, MEX, is just a few short kilometers from the city center. And if you look at information from the top 100 destination airports in the world, you can see that the median distance from the city center to the airport is quite a bit lower than 45 kilometers. In fact, it's less than half of that at about 20. 45 kilometers is long, but it's not off the charts. It's about in the top 20% or so. And there are plenty of mainstream, well-used, quote-unquote, successful airports that are farther from the city center than AIFA is. AIFA isn't even the farthest airport from downtown in Mexico City, since Toluca is 60 kilometers away. But I think a lot of transportation planners might tell you distance itself isn't the best proxy for determining how easy it is to get to an airport. It's really a little bit more about time and money. If you're coming by road, it takes roughly 1 to 2 hours to drive from the city center to the airport, depending on exactly how bad the traffic is. In some select cases with really heavy traffic, it could potentially take up to 3 hours. And from the city center, Uber starts at about 300 pesos to get to the airport, but this can balloon to twice that or even more during peak hours. Notably, Uber typically is also not available when you're trying to leave the airport. So rideshare options are not reliable and viable for people who are trying to head to the city. If you want to go by public transit, the only option at this moment is the Mexibus Line 1 of the BRT system. But to get there, you got to take Metro to Ciudad Azteca and then transfer to Line 1 to take it to Hoja de Agua, which was the original terminus of the line. Then you have to get on an extension that goes to the airport that, from my perspective at least, seemed to be really hastily constructed along a circuitous corridor with limited bus-only lane enforcement and cheap-to-construct Curitiba-style stations. These buses are also not nearly as frequent as you might expect from a BRT system in a huge city. Even with some luck on the connections and even with the dedicated, more or less, BRT lanes that they follow, you're looking at a minimum of 2 hours to get from the city center to the airport. There are 2 more lines of BRT which are currently under construction, Line 2 and Line 4 of Mexibus, which are going to extend to the airport, and they're going to be utilizing the new 8-lane highway that's already just finished to the airport, so that probably could shave some time off the trip. The biggest new public transit option coming, which is likely to be the biggest game changer, is the commuter train connection, expected to be completed in August of 2023. This train will go from the Buena Vista station to the airport and will take somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes to complete that trip. I expect this to really dramatically increase the accessibility since it's going to be faster, cheaper, and more reliable likely than driving or taking an Uber. But for the moment, the transit options are indeed pretty sparse. And while I do think that there's some justifiable criticism for its lack of public accessibility to the city of Mexico City, I do think that the airport needs to be at least acknowledged for its connectivity to the rest of Mexico through its 16-bay long-distance bus station. With this bus station, I do think AIFA becomes a really competitive place to fly, especially if you're coming from an international trip. if you live in one of the major metro areas that is located just north of Mexico City by a few hours. I think this is also a really good option to just get you to and from Mexico City as well. But I do think that there's some strange optics with having to take an inner-city bus to get from the city center to a city's namesake airport. A second big discussion topic related to this new airport is the influence of politics. President AMLO has been pretty specific and direct with his intentions for this airport to reflect more an airport for the common person in Mexico and less for somebody who is interested in international development in the country. So by design, this is a much smaller and less impressive airport than the Texcoco plan. The first phase only has a capacity of 20 million people, just 2 runways instead of 3, and limited room for expansion past the first phase, unlike Texcoco, which was planning to more than double their first phase capacity as they progressed. This was all done by design by AMLO, who was trying to build an airport that was less susceptible to construction corruption and that would serve as a symbol as a fight against excessive opulence and would be practical, not flashy. But the dissenting point of perspective on this is that this is an airport that hampers international development because it's too small, it's located too far, and it's too hard to transfer to other airports from the AIFA location. Dissenters have also pointed out that this is still a pretty opulent and grandiose airport in its own way. AMLO and the construction team for AIFA decided to keep on, for example, Mexican architect Francisco González Pulido, who helped design the passenger terminal, who was also really heavily involved in the Texcoco airport. The AIFA airport, although it's scaled down, still has a lot of all of the latest bells and whistles, has stuff like themed bathrooms and a 4-star hotel with almost 300 rooms, all the latest gate and security tech. If they were really going for a simple airport, I'm not sure if it was really that necessary to have the bathroom feel like you were in a Mexican version of a UNESCO heritage site. And dissenters would also point out that this project was not immune to corruptions, and there were still some issues that came up as it related to unfair practices and fraud. It's just that this corruption, potentially from their perspective at least, favored AMLO and his party as opposed to the opposing political party that was in charge of the Texcoco airport. And the third big discussion point related to this airport is the amount of money and the amount of time it took to construct. So let's look at the numbers here. The new AIFA airport cost roughly $3.5 billion for construction, and the Texcoco airport, by comparison, was much higher at $14 billion. But if you include the $5.5 billion that were required to cancel the Texcoco airport midway, and then you were also to include the $2 billion roughly that were also required to expand the expressway to have more accessibility for the airport, you can see the numbers aren't quite as dramatically different. So it was cheaper, even when you consider the expressway and the cancellation fees for Texcoco, to move forward on the AIFA project. But the question at hand here is AIFA at $10 billion better than having a Texcoco at $13 billion? I don't know. Another quick note on costs as well is that from the user's perspective, flights do cost significantly less if you fly out of AIFA compared to flying out of MEX. This is due to a lower airport usage tariff and also in some cases some potential government incentives. So whether or not you like the new airport as a concept, it's pretty hard to say no to consistent $15 to $20 fares for domestic flights in Mexico. This airport also grabbed attention because of the quickness in which it was built. The airport started construction in June 2019, and it was completed just 880 days later. By comparison, airports typically take a minimum of 5 years to complete. This one took just over 2. Even a new runway typically takes about 2 years to complete from soup to nuts. So this, all things considered, was an incredibly fast construction period for the airport. But some people would argue that the airport finished too fast and opened prematurely. The airport opened with an unfinished access road that lacked signage, no train service, a lack of ride-hail service. It opened with incomplete retail development, an unfinished airport hotel, a makeshift airport lounge, and a hastily constructed BRT connection. The timing of the opening was quite interesting indeed, because the airport opened just a few weeks before AMLO faced a national referendum on whether he should step down before his presidential term ended. So this obviously had something to do with the opening time period, but I think the question at hand is still relevant outside of the politics of the matter. Is it best to open an airport when you have a minimum viable product that does serve the purpose but is still missing bells and whistles? Or is it best to wait until it's fully developed? I think this is an open question that doesn't have an easy answer. And another discussion point related to this airport relates to the demand that this airport has and potentially will have in the future. Currently, there's basically nobody there. The airport, if you pardon the pun, really just hasn't taken off yet. AIFA averages about a dozen or so flights a day, as compared to MEX, which averages more like 900 daily flights. In fact, MEX has about as many flights in an hour as AIFA has in an entire week. The government is actively trying to rectify this imbalance and incentivize people to go to AIFA. I think ultimately, we're going to have to wait and see if AIFA does catch on and becomes an international hub like the AMLO administration is hoping it will be. So before we jump into the lessons learned and the takeaways, just a quick reminder to please like and subscribe if you are enjoying this content and feel like Mexico City airport talk is really what you wanted to watch when you randomly watched a YouTube video today. And if you're really interested in what we're doing, I'd encourage you to take a look through my Patreon account if you're interested in financially supporting the channel. So what do we actually think about this airport? Is it a good thing that they built it? Would they have been much better just keeping Texcoco? Is there maybe some space in this universe for both an AIFA and a Texcoco one day to be operating together? I don't have a crystal ball, and I honestly even don't have a really strong opinion on what would have been the best course of action. Obviously, there are a lot of people, I think, that are quite upset because Texcoco was cut midstream, and that came at tremendous expense. And the new airport that replaced it was very underwhelming as it related to Texcoco. That said, I do think there are some arguments in favor of going with the AIFA airport, especially if you're looking at this from a more of a populist perspective, with the interest of the common person who lives in Mexico maybe more in mind than the international development that could come from an international airport that is huge like Texcoco. That's it for today. Please do remember, if you like this content, to please give me a like and a subscribe, and maybe check out my Patreon account if you'd like to support this channel. Until next time.